Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today, a map of the new normal, how inflation, war, and sanctions will change your world forever. Okay, I didn't write that. Jeff Rubin wrote that. And we are going to talk with him about this book, which is beautiful and clean and classy in its look, but also jam-packed with everything you need to know about. I don't know when we had the conversation 2 years ago when you wrote The Expendables.
Right.
And you know, I've still got people listening to that saying, that guy's really smart. So that's a good thing, Jeff.
I guess.
No, of course it is. All right. What intrigued me was that, and I know because I'd run into you and you said you were writing another book, that this started out as an investigation of sort of the aftermath of and the consequences of COVID, like what was going to happen and the lockdown. And then Ukraine happened, and then a series of global things happened. And you ended up, there was, I think, an interim title, Is There Any Light at the End of the Tunnel?
Correct.
And that's sort of morphed into this. So can we stay on that for a bit? Like, what was your own process? Because we were all locked down for a couple of years in one way or another. So you were writing in real time.
Right. So when I first started discussing the book with my publisher, it was about how the economy would come out of the pandemic. Right. And what the lasting consequences of that might be. And the first two chapters of this book, or the first three chapters of this book, is roughly from that original exercise. But as you point out, Pamela, of course, the war in Ukraine started, and it created a whole chain reaction of events. And then were bigger things going on in the economy than just coming out of the pandemic. The whole, delinking, friendshoring, that, economic warfare by any other name.
Right.
So I thought that, and my publisher agreed, that superseded the original project of the book, but it also explains why it took me 2 years to write it, which is twice as long as what it normally takes me.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the genesis of the book and how it developed.
Yeah, your single line here is so great. The epidemiological story is all but over, but the shift in the way our economies operate has barely begun, meaning that these changes are not only significant, but have rearranged the whole thinking about it, not the least of which was massive government spending around the world, which has altered books and psychologies.
Yes, and massive government spending financed by central banks printing money on a scale not seen before, and that will have consequences. As the American economist Milton Friedman said, inflation is everywhere and at all times a monetary phenomenon. So when the money supply in Canada grows by 40%, as it did during the lockdowns, it shouldn't be surprising that we saw reflation. All that was needed was something to light that powder keg. And sanctions against the largest energy and food exporter in the world blew that powder keg sky high.
Yeah, that's an amazing part of the story. And I want to come back to that as quickly as possible. But the numbers here, because we've just come through a federal budget presentation, then a story that struck me, which is the finance minister hiked the national debt ceiling for the second time in 3 years to a record $2.1 trillion. It signals to me that the debt is so massive, but the spending will continue.
Yes, and Pamela, in my former life, and as you know, I was the chief economist of CIBC World Markets, and I used to go around the world trying to sell this debt after every budget, as that's what a chief economist of an investment bank does. The natural check on how much a government could spend was that the more it borrowed, the higher the cost of borrowing.
Yeah.
And the higher the cost of borrowing, the more that taxpayers' money goes to debt servicing as opposed to vote-getting program spending. And that was sort of the natural checks and balance, if you so speak. And that went out the window with the pandemic, because as we were racking up a $330 billion deficit or a $3 trillion deficit in the United States, interest rates fell to all-time lows. By some standards, the lowest in 5,000 years of recorded history, which
like
flies
zero.
in the face of that relationship.
Yeah.
So the obvious question is, well, why would pension plans and insurance companies or even retail investors want to buy bonds in the face of that deficit at such a low yield? And of course, they wouldn't. They weren't the ones buying the bonds. It was the central banks buying the bonds. And unlike an insurance company or a pension plan, they don't care about market performance. They're not marked every quarter,
Right.
or at least they don't think that they care. But on the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada, and indeed the Federal Reserve Board and the European Central Bank, are billions and billions of dollars of bond losses, because they bought these bonds at an all-time high price. And with every passing year, the price has become lower and lower and lower.
So what happens? I mean, this is, I think you said it's after the rate hits zero, the interest rates hit zero, it loses any kind of stimulus power, which it's supposed to be having, even in the unique times of the pandemic, that it's kind of like pushing on a string. Now, these guys didn't invent it. This started in Japan way back when.
Quantitative easing,
right?
Just a fancy word for printing money. You're right. But when you say interest rates at zero pushing on a string, you're referring to the short-term central bank rate. But what quantitative easing did was allowed them to bring down long-term interest rates, bond yields. And that's what mortgage rates are priced off. Right. And they did that by just buying the bonds on a scale never seen before. And no one was complaining, because after all, the more bonds they bought, the lower bond yields, the lower your mortgage rate, right? So who's complaining? And that worked just fine, but it all depended on one thing and one thing only: inflation. Yeah. I mean, you can do that when inflation is below the target rate. But if inflation's running at 3 to 4 times the target rate, all of a sudden the emperor is wearing no clothes. Yeah. And central banks have to do something.
So what do you think is just going to happen on that issue? We're starting to see, some central banks like Switzerland and Sweden, they're starting to lower the rates, even though they haven't met their targets, right? Even though inflation is still up, but they're just saying we have to do it because there's all these other crises that are associated, like in Canada, the mortgage debt that's coming due, which could be catastrophic.
Well, you raise a number of interesting points. Let me talk about the mortgages. Yeah. Right now, 20% of all the mortgages of TD, BMO, and my alma mater, CIBC, are negative amortizations, about $130 billion in mortgages. That means that your monthly payment doesn't even cover the interest. The uncovered, unpaid interest gets capitalized, added to the loan. So instead of paying off your mortgage over time, as is the standard practice, your mortgage actually gets bigger. And it gets bigger at a time of falling housing prices. Yeah. And you know what? That reminds me of 2008, when people just sent in the keys and you had record mortgage defaults, because when people don't have their own equity at play, it's real easy to walk. Yeah. So now, on the other question that you raised, saying, some central banks are lowering interest rates even before they hit their target. I think the more fundamental question here is the target still valid? For most of these
Yep.
countries, 2% is the inflation target, as it is for the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board. But that dealt with a different world. Okay, that dealt with a totally different world. Today, over a third of global trade is now subject to sanctions. And the
Yep.
way that sanctions are going, that'll soon be 50%. Are those inflation targets anymore attainable? And if they're not attainable, why would we trade jobs to try to achieve them? Which is, the trade-off that central
This
banks have to
2%,
make.
we got to get to 2% before we can lower the
Exactly.
rate. Yeah.
And while I've heard a lot of central banks warn people that rates are not going back to the levels that existed during the pandemic, I have yet to hear a central bank say, we don't think the 2% inflation target is achievable anymore, and our new target is X. It's as if nothing in the world has changed that would affect future price behavior, where I'm arguing everything in the world has changed that will affect price behavior.
Yeah. No, I think it is absolutely where we're at in terms of, this odd circumstance, which is we had this huge crisis and our economy shut down. And in a bizarre way, everybody never had it so good.
Everybody, the big easy, as I call it. And that's originally what the book was going to be about before it took a U-turn, but absolutely right. And no one was complaining. No one was complaining about the size of the deficit, because after all, people's mortgages weren't going down. They weren't going up, they were going down. And those deficits were created by generous handouts. So, what's not to like here? But the problem was it's not sustainable, as we've discovered.
Well, and now we've got, civil servants arguing that they should never have to go back to work.
Not just civil servants. Times have changed. I worked 20 years on Bay Street. Yeah. And the notion that I would work at home was not a credible notion. Okay. Today, if you go down to the underground Brookfield Place, TD, First Canadian Place, on a Monday or Friday, you would think it's a public holiday, no one's there, and every third shop is for rent. Because now, long after there is any public health rationale to support the process, now people work, at most 2 to 3 days in the office. They typically bookend the weekends. And what it's created is, the irony that we have a rental crisis, yet in North America, there's 3 billion square feet of unoccupied office space.
Right.
And the challenge is going to be because it looks like working from home is now going to become a permanent feature of the labor force. If that's the case, then all of a sudden CIBC, TD, BMO don't need half the real estate that they've got. Can we convert them into rentals? And that's going to be the challenge going forward, because, as I say, this has long outlived any public health rationale.
Yeah. And I mean, you get some sense if you look at those big towers on Bay Street, like what are people going to do? Go and live in these little offices that it kind of reminds me of the places in Japan at the subway stations where you can rent a bread box to lie down.
You got to do something with them. I'll give you an example. If you look at the Allied Properties, they're probably the biggest office REIT in Canada. Their stock is trading at 30% of what it was before the pandemic. So, I mean, it has fundamentally changed the economics of office space.
Okay, so not only did we stop going to work and think that that was going to be permanent, and we got lots of handouts in one way or another, and our real estate was worth more. But the one thing that became so abundantly obvious to us all, I think, during the pandemic is that we couldn't meet our own needs. We couldn't make vaccines. We couldn't make masks. we didn't have any industrial capacity because globalization, we were going to get it very cheap from somewhere else who could pay somebody $1.50 to make all that stuff. And we could always get it, but we couldn't.
That's right. And that was the first real challenge to the model of globalization, which of course we've been told, makes everybody better off. And
Yeah.
is, just in time became just too late. And it wasn't about lawn chairs. It was about vaccines or respirators or masks at the time of the greatest public health challenge since the Spanish flu. So that really underscored, I think, our concern about globalization. We lost confidence in globalization, and that spurred a whole new movement of economic self-sufficiency. Which was a major theme of the Trump administration and has been continued with the Biden administration. So that was really the first real challenge to globalization, that it was going to reshape supply lines. But the sanctions have now taken that to a whole other level. And now, we're not going back to the old world. I mean, sure, I'm sure that in 12 to 15 months, the war in Ukraine will come to some kind of conclusion, but it's not going back. The world economy isn't going back to the pre-sanctions world. Sanctions are part of the new normal, and so are the consequences of sanctions.
Yeah, this is the thing that you write about, that, this is the West in many cases cutting off our nose to spite our face. We think we're really morally responding to this bad behavior from Russia or China, whoever it may be, Iran. But it ends up hurting us.
It ends up boomeranging.
Yeah.
And opening up a Pandora's box of unintended consequences. Okay. Certainly accelerating the rise of a new global order, and a new global order that openly challenges our leadership, and that now includes, once bitter enemies, in some sense still bitter enemies, Iran and Saudi Arabia. But it's a statement that, there are countries lining up to join BRICS, and that, BRICS now has economic power that they've never had before. The four leading growth countries in the world in the last 20 years have been China, Russia, Brazil, India, and number 5 is Saudi Arabia. The US is a distant 12th. So.
No, just let's stop for a sec there, because that's it. I mean, that's what the BRIC acronym stands for. Brazil, Russia, India, China. That was going to be a new big powerhouse and a kind of a counterbalance to the West. But now they are doubling in size, and your numbers in the book, I think, are they will all, including Iran, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, all the people they've invited in. This is 45% of the global oil reserves, 60% of the world's natural gas, and a whole lot of people.
Yeah, and the majority of global GDP. So, the days where the United States and its Western allies can just unilaterally dictate how the world's going to work, those days are over.
Yeah. So let's walk through that, because it is, I mean, this the BRICS and the expanded BRICS, half of humanity, as you say, GDP greater than the US, double the size of the EU. But the US is still kind of leading in tech and finance. So there's still some balance there.
Right. So the question then becomes, are sanctions achieving what they're intended to do? Right. They're intended to cripple the Russian economy, and they're intended to prevent China from accessing new chip technology. Okay. Right. Well, as far as crippling the Russian economy is concerned, they had a brief recession, but guess what? Germany and the UK, the whole Eurozone had a deeper recession. And China, for all of our attempts to prevent them from acquiring chip technology, it's a bit like defying economic gravity, because the largest chip market is going to attract the leading chip technology. So lo and behold, Huawei's new phone has 5G technology that China wasn't supposed to have. And the Kirin chip that enables that is manufactured by the Chinese semiconductor factory, a state-owned company. So if anything is going to be a prod for China to develop chip technology, it's sanctions. Because China can't just rely on Apple or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation or Samsung to sell its advanced chips. Okay, if it wants advanced chips, it's got to develop it itself, and China has the wherewithal to do that.
You make the same case about Russia, that because
With
they didn't
airplanes.
have access to their plane parts, they went, okay, we'll figure it out.
Yeah. And by the way, China's not waiting for sanctions to be applied to their aerospace. They've already got their own plane, and they're just not going to sell it. Russia and China aren't just going to sell their planes in Russia and China. They're going to sell it in third countries, in BRICS countries, and that's going to come at the expense of Boeing and Airbus.
And when we watched the sanctions at the front end, where we had a parade of European leaders led by Germany coming over and saying to countries like Canada, please help us. We're allies. This fight in Ukraine is important, but the sanctions on Russia are killing us because we buy all their oil. Could you please send us some LNG? We said, no, we're way more concerned about the climate. We can't do that.
We'll send them some hydrogen.
Yeah. But we didn't do that.
No, but the US did.
Yeah.
In fact,
and LNG. Yeah.
What's happened is they have Germany, and this is one of the reasons why the German economy is in so much trouble. Germany has replaced cheap pipeline natural gas with very expensive LNG from the United States.
Yep.
So that's great for the US natural gas industry. The US natural gas industry now exports more LNG than by pipeline to Canada or Mexico. But it's not so great for Germany, or for that matter, all the other countries in the EU who are paying soaring energy costs.
But we're kind of getting hit double whammy, because we didn't want to participate in LNG because of our views on the climate, et cetera. But also, the first thing Joe Biden did when he came to office was shut down Keystone.
Yeah. And you know why he did that? Joe Biden rightfully argues that building fossil fuel infrastructure like pipelines only perpetuates the use of fossil fuels. I agree with that. You don't build a pipeline for 2 years. But how come it's okay to perpetuate the use of fossil fuels when it's American LNG, that, by the way, is 10 times more emission intensive than natural gas in a pipeline? How come it's okay for Germany to switch to American LNG and perpetuate the use of fossil fuels in the German economy, but not okay to build Keystone XL would perpetuate the use of fossil fuels in the United States? Could it be that the LNG is from the Gulf Coast and the bitumen from Alberta?
Yeah. No, this is like where we're now into, and we'll take a little diversion here because we can't help it, is we're into election season in both countries. I mean, the US has a plan, so we know when their election is. Ours is inevitable sometime in the next year. And it's just everybody's looking at what goes on in the US. I think it's 50-50 at this point in terms of who's elected. We don't know yet. Wait till the court cases settle out a bit. Paint us a picture of the map of the new normal, depending on which one of those guys is elected.
Well, in one sense, it's not going to matter, because the interests of the United States is diametrically opposed to the interests of China and Russia. And this is not good versus evil. This is Game of Thrones. Okay,
Yeah.
this is competing powers. Okay, in Europe, it might make a difference because Donald Trump has made it abundantly clear that Ukraine is not of strategic interest to the United States. And he's also questioned NATO itself. Okay, so certainly it might affect the final outcome in Ukraine, but Ukraine is only one fault line.
Yeah.
The Sea of, the Taiwan Sea is another, Gaza is another,
Yeah.
but it could have a material impact on the Ukrainian conflict because, of course, if the White House shut off military aid to Ukraine, that war would be over in weeks.
Yeah. If not hours. The other thing, and I saw it with interest the other day, Bernie Sanders saying what's happening on campuses across the US in response to Israel-Gaza situation could be his Vietnam. Like
It's
this,
reminiscent of that. It's
yeah,
reminiscent of that, yeah.
that this is going to, and Biden says sort of on one day, they're Israel's closest friend, and on the next, trying to tell Netanyahu what to do, and meanwhile, going around the circle to make sure that their energy supplies, their backups are there.
Right. But you can't help but think that this is in some way contrived. I mean, what Hamas did, they knew that Netanyahu was the most anti-Arab right-wing prime minister in Israel. His reaction couldn't come as a huge surprise to anybody,
No,
right?
absolutely
I
not.
mean, he was the guy that they could rely on to respond the way he did. And I think, I don't know whether Iran pulled the strings or not, but certainly Iran was threatened, greatly threatened, I'd argue, by the Abrams Accord. If you get Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United States to form a NATO type alliance, you would have great concerns with that if you were the Iranian government. So, Hamas is expendable from Iran's perspective. And they did what they thought they had to do. But again, this is yet just another fault line between, tectonic movements in geopolitical plates.
Yeah.
And while every conflict has its local flavor and its own historical context, this is, as I said earlier, Game of Thrones. It's moving chess pieces around the world.
Having a conversation a couple of weeks back with Walter Russell Mead on some of these big geopolitical shifts that are taking place, and he says people have predicted the demise of the American empire many, many times before, but this somehow feels different, and that we are headed in a way that just the balance is shifting given China's power and population.
Well, and not just China, but as I said earlier, Pamela, the 5 fastest growing economies, and not just in 1 year, because 1 year, in the last 20 years, are all in BRICS. Okay.
Yeah.
With economic power comes military power.
Yeah.
Now, I'll point out something that, we always hear about China's military buildup. Well, guess what? The Chinese economy is almost as big as the US economy. Bigger if you measure it in purchasing power parity, but it measured in US dollars, almost as big. Yet its defense spending is only 25% of the US. In fact, the US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries together, and more than the entire GDP of Africa. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that America's overwhelming military superiority is not sustainable, because these other countries like India, Russia, and China have a lot more room to spend a much bigger percentage of their GDP on defense than they do now. And that's something that you never hear of. You just see these,
Right.
foreboding pictures of Chinese militia in uniform looking very sternly like they're going to kill you. But the fact of the matter is that China's defense spending, while it's growing markedly, is a quarter of that of the US.
But they have, because of the technology and just the mass of population, I mean, they have other ways to do battle.
As we're discovering, like the Houthis.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Here you got all these aircraft carriers, but drones are
Yeah.
changing the whole nature of warfare. And it's now allowing, tribal clans to close
Yeah.
down global sea trade. And the US Navy doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is so fundamental, but there's almost another level at which, where it used to be good and evil, and America, the West was good, and China and Russia were evil. There is now kind of a little bit of a shift in the thinking that it's just two different worldviews.
Yeah. Yeah. Now,
One is not
still
good, one is not evil. I mean, we all
in the
have our views,
media,
but yeah,
the CBC would call it Putin's war, as if
yeah,
he's the only one of 144 million Russians who object to NATO doubling its size, and the entire Russian European border, with the exception of Belarus and Ukraine, has NATO missiles. Could it be that this is broader than just Putin's
yeah.
war, and that President Xi is the only person who thinks that Taiwan is part of China, even though it has been since the 17th century? So, again, it's good versus evil versus Game of Thrones, and obviously you know which camp I'm in.
Yeah, no, for sure. So what kind of, you're talking about the map of the new normal, and we're heading down a road that nobody's seen and nobody could have predicted. What kind of timelines in this world do you look at? Like, is this, when we saw how quickly things changed, I guess this is what always amazes me with the pandemic. We were able to turn some things around on a dime, and other things were still, how to fix the healthcare system. We can't seem to do that. So how does this unfold? On what
I think it
time?
unfolds very rapidly. And I think it unfolds at an escalating rate. And not all of it is negative. For example, friendshoring. Okay,
Yeah,
we're going to see the return of the middle class because factory jobs that we thought were gone forever and never going to come back are coming back in a hurry. But, what's good for the middle class is not good for inflation. I mean, Apple's major supplier, Foxconn in China, where they produce 95% of the iPhones and Macs, pay $1.50 an hour. California, Apple's home
right,
state, if they made the computers in Cupertino, California, they'd be paying $15.50 an hour. Could
right,
you still afford to buy an iPhone? Would be my question. So
right.
we've gotten used to living off the
Yeah.
avails of cheap overseas labor in almost everything that we consume. And that era is coming to an end. So
But
everything that we're going to make here is going to cost us a lot more money.
but that's what I mean. So that means people are going to rejoin unions and make demands, and inflation is going to go up, and our currency is not going to be worth as much. Like, this is not a pretty picture.
No, on the whole, no. There are some silver linings, like the return of factory
Right.
jobs and maybe a slight recovery of the middle class that has been decimated. But on the whole, if the whole idea of international trade comparative advantage is to make everyone better off, then it follows that economic sanctions do the exact opposite. They make everybody worse off. And when you exclude the grain and oil of the largest exporter in the world, you'll find that the costs of finding substitutes becomes more and more expensive. And that's not what I'm trying to argue is this isn't a temporary shock. Like, yeah, maybe the war in Ukraine will be over in 12 months. The sanctions aren't coming off. In fact, Trump's already gone on record, and Biden usually follows him. He's going to raise the tariffs on China another 20%.
Yeah.
So where
So
does that leave the price of an iPhone is my
right.
question.
Yeah. Well, that is the question. So, I mean, the sanctions, which again, we did for political purposes and you know, sending messages and signals and being morally superior in many senses, they've just worked around them. They will always work around them. They will find a way. So it's hard then for the West to say, oh, well, we're going to back down on sanctions because, you know, they worked around it, because that was their moral positioning.
Right. India and China, with their huge markets, have sanctioned Russian goods with open arms.
Yeah.
And these economies are growing a lot faster than the Western economies. So the impact of sanctions, they've been totally ineffective in doing what they were supposed to do, which was either to bring the Russian economy down on its knees, or similarly keep China 10 years behind us. But what they have done is what they brought down to its knees is the whole global trading order, the whole WTO that we've been told was the basis of our collective prosperity for the last 40 years. WTO trading rules now lie in tatters. Over a third of global trade is sanctioned.
So what happens here, Jeff? That's, you know, I'm reading stuff almost on a daily basis, and you've alluded to it a couple of times that Trump says something and then Biden follows, and you know, we see
Has
it.
Biden cut one tariff? Do you remember how the Democrats were condemning Trump's
Yeah.
tariffs as backward and da da da? Has Biden cut one tariff? No. Has he appointed any appellate judges at the WTO that Trump refused to do? No. And I bet you come November, when Trump says, I'm going to raise tariffs on China by 20%, Biden's going to go, me too.
Yeah. So that carries on, but here's the issue. Like, if there's no big distinctions between left and right, between Democrats and Republicans, and you know, you could argue that even on our in our world, the distinctions aren't that massive. Politics, I mean, personalities aside, then what you don't have is a left-right political divide. You've got a class divide.
Exactly. And as I argued in my last book, political polarity has changed. I mean, Donald Trump is working class hero. Okay, the mega Americans, okay, their constituency is the American worker. It used to be, the left wing of the Democratic Party. Okay, but in the end, Bernie Sanders, whose views on the economy aren't that dissimilar from Donald Trump, the cultural divide was too great. And, but I'm just saying political polarity has totally changed. I mean, the NDP in the days of David Lewis, Broadbent, was a working class party. Today's NDP is not a working class party.
So what happens here? What do you see? I mean, we're now in the midst of a battle on things like taxation, capital gains taxes, things like that, which are going to impact that middle class even more dramatically.
Right, Pamela. But I think also we're going back to the old world that I used to operate in at CIBC World Markets. If governments want to spend, they're going to have to pay higher interests, because the Bank of Canada is not just going to be rolling the printing presses. Okay. So again, that's going to affect whether voters want to see these size of deficits, if the deficits bring with it higher mortgage rates. Now, they didn't. The opposite happened during the pandemic, but that was an anomaly that I don't think is going to repeat itself. So I guess the question will be, Pamela, will we now see more responsible fiscal policy now that there's a cost, an interest rate cost to spending that there wasn't during the pandemic?
So is that the driver for change? I mean, is that why people in some way or another saying, look, we just can't keep doing this?
Right. I mean, if it means that maybe I can't qualify for a mortgage rate because a 5-year fixed mortgage is 7% because the 5-year government of Canada yield has gone up 200 basis points because of the size of the deficit. People have connected those dots before.
Yep.
They'll connect them again as long as the printing presses at the Bank of Canada don't go back in overdrive. And I think that's going to be harder to do with today's inflation.
And it also raises a question, because we're starting to see some movement on this, the embrace of ESG and the climate actions, and individuals are starting to say, look, I don't want those rules on my pension funds or my bank accounts. I need to live off this. Take your politics and have a protest.
That's right. And particularly when we consider the impact that sanctions have had on our efforts to mitigate climate change. Because while it's covered with a lot of greenwash, the reality is the exact opposite. And we touched a bit on that with the discussion of the US LNG exports to Germany.
So how does that, I mean, does that mean the public will say enough? Like
I believe that, and see what's happened in the case of oil stocks and gas stocks. If the Caisse de dépôt or Ontario teachers don't want to own this, the retail investor is more than willing to fill the gap. The difference is the retail investor doesn't want CapEx, doesn't want investment in new reserves. He just wants share buybacks and dividends. And that's a guarantee for high oil prices, because without reinvestment, where's the supply growth? Meanwhile, world demand for oil and coal will set a new record high this year.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, are you, like, when you finished writing these books, after we talked about the expendables, which is what globalization did the middle class, now we're into the global version of that, really, in terms of all these geopolitical factors are doing the same, but even wider.
Yes, I believe so.
The impact is even wider across all the classes that we've just discussed. Like, this is a very pessimistic view.
It's a realistic view. And I think it's important to understand, as I dedicated the book, to a clearer understanding of what's going on in the world, because it's not just about good versus evil.
Right. And make your decisions about how you're going to, what you're going to spend your dollar on, and where you're going to.
Yes, because inflation is back.
Yeah, it's back. Jeff, great to talk to you. A map of the new normal. This is just a superb read, how inflation, war, and sanctions will change your world forever. And you're right. That's what the dedication was. Get smart, educate yourself, figure out where you're living, and then make some decisions based on that.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at. Jeff Rubin, really great to talk to you. We'll see you again in what, 2 years, when you get down? Maybe it'll be shorter this time, because there's no pandemic. We'll see you in a year. Thanks again, Jeff. And that is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you again soon.